I want you to picture something in your mind right now. Um, just imagine if the American flag was actually designed by the British Empire to somehow subjugate the colonies. It sounds completely absurd,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Like something straight out of a dystopian novel. But an exact parallel to that is actually flying over Havana right now.
Right. If you look at the national flag of Cuba today, and you've definitely seen it, it's got that vivid red triangle resting against the 3 blue and 2 white horizontal stripes. And it has that single 5-pointed white star right in the center.
Yeah, that is the absolute globally recognized symbol of an independent, sovereign Cuban nation. I mean, it's a really powerful symbol of self-determination.
It is. But here's the massive historical contradiction that we are exploring in our deep dive today. That emblem of Cuban independence was originally designed in the United States.
And not just in the U.S., but it was financed by wealthy American slaveholders. Its original purpose, like the literal reason it was sewn together, was to symbolize the exact opposite of an independent Cuba.
Which is just staggering cognitive dissonance. I mean, that flag was meticulously designed to be a banner of annexation. The men who funded it, the hands that physically stitched the first prototype, they all intended for that flag to fly over Cuba, not as a sovereign nation.
No, not at all. They wanted it to be a brand new slave state, permanently annexed into the American Republic. They didn't just march in to loot the place.
Right. They actually sit down and meticulously design a banner to justify their presence. And that design wasn't an accident. It was a highly calculated geopolitical threat.
Exactly. So to understand how a flag meant to expand the American slave empire becomes the symbol of Cuban freedom, we are going to structure this entire conversation as a biography.
But not a biography of a person. A biography of the Lone Star flag itself. We're going to trace its birth, its really bloody baptism on the beaches of Cuba, and then its incredibly strange afterlife.
It's such a fascinating framework, and to understand this forgotten clandestine U.S. war against Cuba between 1849 and 1851, we have to start with the man who first raised that flag.
Right, we need to look at Narciso López.
Whoa.
Because you simply cannot understand the threads of that flag without understanding the absolute psychological whiplash of his life.
You really can't. Because if you were a casting director looking for the ultimate hero of Cuban liberation, Lopez's resume would look completely wrong from the very first line.
I mean, right off the bat, he wasn't even Cuban.
No, he wasn't. He was born in 1797 near Caracas in Venezuela. But more importantly than where he was born is the mechanism of who he fought for in his youth and why.
So when you look at South American history in the early 19th century, the dominant narrative is Simon Bolivar, right? You have these massive sweeping wars for independence fighting to throw off the Spanish Empire.
Right, and Narciso López was right there in the thick of it. But he did not fight for independence. He fought for the Spanish crown. He was a royalist.
He actually fought against Bolivar's liberation armies. Like, specifically at the decisive Battle of Carabobo in 1821, he was literally the empire's enforcer.
He really was, which is so ironic.
Wait, let's pause and really look at the mechanics of that. The man who is going to become the supposed great liberator of Cuba starts his career actively trying to crush Latin American independence.
Yeah.
That's like a famous union-busting corporate lawyer suddenly deciding to lead a historic labor strike. It completely defies logic. Why would a young man in South America fight for the colonial masters against his own neighbors?
Well, it really comes down to the mechanics of class, wealth, and fear. You have to remember what the Spanish Empire represented to the elites of South America at that time.
It represented stability, I'm guessing.
Exactly. It
Right.
represented the protection of property and the existing social hierarchy. The revolutionary armies, on the other hand, brought chaos. They brought the threat of massive social upheaval.
Right, because for men like Lopez, who came from merchant or landowning classes, the idea of a populist revolution was terrifying.
Oh, absolutely. They looked at the bloody racial and class uprisings that had happened earlier in places like Haiti, and they decided that the heavy hand of the Spanish king was vastly preferable.
Preferable to the unpredictable violence of a revolution. So he wasn't just blindly following orders. He was actively fighting to preserve a highly unequal status quo that directly benefited him.
Precisely. But, Bolivar wins. The Spanish Empire is driven out of South America. And if you are Narciso López and you just spent years fighting for the losing side, you can't exactly stick around Caracas.
No, you cannot. You are persona non grata. So after the Spanish lose, López emigrates to Cuba, which was known as the ever-faithful Isle, one of the very few crown jewels still firmly under Spanish control in the Americas.
And for a long time, the empire actually rewards his loyalty. They treat him exceptionally well. He marries into the extremely wealthy Cuban plantation class.
He secures the bag. He gets access to that massive sugar money.
Massive money. And he rises rapidly through the ranks of the Spanish colonial military. He becomes a colonel, then a general. He's even appointed to administrative posts.
He eventually becomes a provincial military governor in Cuba, right? So for 2 decades, he is the establishment. He's enforcing the laws, suppressing dissent, and prospering under the colonial order.
The exact same colonial order he will later try to violently overthrow, which makes his eventual pivot even more bizarre.
It really does. If you're living the high life, married into immense wealth, wielding government power, you don't usually wake up on a Tuesday and decide to become a rogue revolutionary.
No, you don't.
So what is the mechanism that breaks his loyalty?
The breaking point occurs around 1843, and it is entirely bureaucratic and political. There are massive administrative shifts back in Madrid. A new captain general is sent to Cuba, essentially a new colonial CEO.
Okay, so there's a sweeping changing of the guard. And López loses his official positions. He's stripped of his military governorship and completely sidelined.
Right, and his business ventures, including this big coal mining operation, they start to fail without his government connections to prop them up.
So the empire didn't commit some grand moral atrocity that opened his eyes, they just fired him.
Essentially, yes. It's only after he loses his position, his influence, and his access to the levers of power that his personal grievance begins to harden into active opposition to Spanish rule.
When you look at the historical record,
Yeah.
how do historians actually reconcile this? Look, if I put myself in the shoes of someone trying to judge his legacy, I have to ask about his motives.
And it's a huge debate.
Was this a genuine conversion to the cause of human liberty? Or was this just the ultimate grievance of a disgruntled former executive? Like, you took away my corner office, so I'm going to burn the company to the ground.
It is the central interpretive tension of his life. And historians still fiercely debate it today. When you dig into the archives, you find evidence supporting both sides.
What's the argument for him being a sincere convert?
Well, some scholars suggest that once he was forced outside the protective bubble of the imperial administration, he finally saw the brutality of Spanish colonial rule for what it was, and that his desire for Cuban freedom was real.
Okay, and on the flip side?
On the other hand, you have compelling arguments that he was a supreme opportunist, a man whose ego simply couldn't handle being marginalized, and who adopted the language of revolution merely as a tool to regain power.
But I mean, whatever his internal psychological state was, the physical reality is undeniable. By 1848, he is actively conspiring against the state.
He is. And the Spanish authorities catch wind of his plotting. They initiate a brutal crackdown on dissidents, and López is forced to flee Cuba for his life.
And he heads straight to the United States.
Yeah.
Which makes sense, because if you want to launch a revolution, if you want to invade an island fortress like Cuba, you need an army and a mountain of money.
And Cuba was defended by tens of thousands of professional Spanish troops. You needed massive resources. And in 1848, having just concluded the Mexican-American War, the United States is absolutely brimming with both men and money.
Right. You have thousands of demobilized, combat-tested soldiers looking for action. And you have incredibly wealthy political interests looking to expand their influence.
Which brings us to the core mechanism behind the creation of our flag. López arrives in the U.S. with this grand vision of Cuban liberation.
But to get the physical fabric woven, to get the rifles bought, the ammunition stockpiled, and the steamships chartered, he has to find backers. He has to raise capital.
And he finds that capital in the post-Mexican-American War South. But these wealthy interests, they have a fundamentally different vision for what that flag is going to represent.
And this is where we have to redefine a word for you listening. A word that has completely changed its meaning in modern American politics. The filibuster.
Yes. Today, when we hear filibuster, we immediately picture a politician standing on the Senate floor, reading the phone book for 14 hours to delay a procedural vote.
It's entirely a legislative tactic now.
Yeah.
But in the 1850s, a filibuster was something much more literal, much more violent, and deeply tied to American expansion.
Absolutely. The word itself has a fascinating linguistic journey. It descends from the Dutch word vrijbuiter, which translates literally to freebooter, essentially someone who takes free plunder.
So it literally starts as a word for pirates.
Exactly. From there, it passes into French as flibustier and Spanish as filibustero. Those were the specific terms used for Caribbean buccaneers and pirates in the 17th and 18th centuries.
But by the mid-19th century, Americans had repurposed the term. A filibuster was no longer just a pirate on the high seas.
No, it was a private American citizen who raised or joined a mercenary army to invade a foreign country. And crucially, the target was always a country that the United States government was formally at peace with.
And the overarching goal of these private armies was to seize territory, right? Topple the local government, establish a brief independent republic, and then quickly annex that territory into the United States.
That was the exact playbook.
Let's make sure we are crystal clear on the legal mechanics of this. This was not some legal gray area. This was not an early version of a government-sanctioned proxy war.
No, it was wildly, blatantly illegal under U.S. federal law. We are talking about the Neutrality Acts of 1794 and 1818.
It was a severe federal offense to organize, fund, or launch a military expedition from American soil against a nation at peace with the United States. And Spain and the U.S. were at peace.
So every single person involved in this was committing a massive federal crime. But to understand why it was happening anyway, why prominent citizens were openly flouting federal law, we have to look at the political machinery of the 1840s.
Right, because Manifest Destiny had suddenly hit a massive brick wall.
Exactly. This intense religious-like ideology that the U.S. was destined by God to expand across the continent. The government had just taken massive territories from Mexico, California, Nevada, Utah.
But there was fierce, paralyzing political resistance in Washington to officially taking any more land. Because every single time they brought in new territory, it acted like a grenade thrown into Congress.
Over the issue of slavery, every new square mile raised the explosive question, will this new territory allow slavery, or will it be free?
The federal government couldn't officially expand anymore without ripping the country apart. It upset the delicate balance of power in the Senate.
So they needed a workaround.
Let me offer an analogy here to explain how they bypassed this roadblock. If the U.S. government was a massive corporate monopoly, let's say a tech giant under severe antitrust scrutiny, and they couldn't legally acquire any more territory.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
These southern planters were basically acting as angel investors. They were funding unregulated, off-the-books startup armies to execute hostile takeovers on their behalf.
That's a perfect way to put it. If the startup fails, the U.S. government denies all knowledge. If the startup succeeds, the U.S. government eventually swoops in and acquires the new territory.
They effectively privatized the violent conquests of Manifest Destiny.
That is exactly the mechanism at play. Filibustering was the privatized venture capital continuation of Manifest Destiny. And Narciso López walks right into the epicenter of this movement.
Desperately looking for funding for his revolution. And his most important political and financial sponsor becomes a man named John A. Quitman.
Quitman is a major player. He's the sitting governor of Mississippi. He's a former combat general from the Mexican-American War, an ardent expansionist, and a vastly wealthy figure in the Southern establishment.
Okay, here is where we have to look impartially but unflinchingly at the horrifying reality of what shaped our flag. What is the actual calculated motivation of Governor Quitman and his network of Southern financiers?
Because they're absolutely not writing massive checks out of the goodness of their hearts to help some exiled Cuban poet find democracy.
No. Their motivations were purely economic and deeply rooted in racial ideology.
To understand their chilling calculus, you have to understand what was known at the time as the All-Mexico problem.
Right. During the Mexican-American War, there was a very vocal faction of extreme expansionists who didn't just want Texas and California. They wanted the U.S. military to push down and annex the entirety of Mexico.
All of it. But they didn't. The U.S. Army captured Mexico City. They had the country defeated, but they stopped and drew a line.
Why? What was the mechanism that halted them?
They stopped because of deeply ingrained racial and social ideology. When you look at the fiery speeches of men like John C. Calhoun at the time, you see the exact logic.
Annexing all of Mexico was politically and socially unpalatable for these southern elites because of the demographics.
Exactly. Mexico had a massive population of millions of people who were mixed race, Catholic, and crucially for the South, Mexico had already abolished slavery.
So to swallow Mexico meant incorporating millions of free, non-white citizens into the American Republic. And to the racial ideologues of the 1840s South, this was completely unacceptable.
They referred to it openly as the race problem. They wanted the land, but they absolutely did not want the people who lived on it.
But when they looked 90 miles south of Florida to Cuba, the math changed completely.
The math flipped entirely. Cuba was attractive to the Southern annexationists, not despite the institution of slavery, but precisely because of it. Cuba was what economic historians call a mature slave society.
Explain what that means mechanically. How does a mature slave society differ from just expanding into empty territory?
Well, if a Southern planter moved out to the newly acquired territories in Texas or beyond, they had to start from scratch. They had to clear the land, build the infrastructure, and import the enslaved labor.
It was risky and took years to turn a profit.
Right. But Cuba was already fully operational. Its massive, highly lucrative sugar and coffee plantation economy was completely entrenched.
And its enslaved population, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, was already held in brutal, codified bondage by the Spanish authorities. It was a turnkey operation.
A turnkey operation. You just change the flag on the flagpole and the massive profits instantly start flowing into American banks instead of Spanish ones.
That is a truly horrific way to view a human society. But that is exactly how they viewed it. It was just an acquisition.
That is exactly the framework. From the perspective of Governor Quitman and his network, annexing Cuba wouldn't just add immense economic wealth, it would add massive, immediate political power.
It would bring a new, incredibly wealthy slave state, or possibly be carved into several slave states into the Union. That means more pro-slavery votes in the U.S. Senate.
It tilts the delicate balance of power in Washington permanently toward the South, ensuring the survival of the institution of slavery. And it does this all without having to deal with the free, mixed-race population that made Mexico a non-starter.
So look at the stark contrast of what is happening in these strategy meetings. We have two radically different, incompatible realities coexisting in this one movement.
It's fascinating. You have Narciso López writing these grand manifestos, speaking the sweeping romantic language of Cuban liberty and throwing off the yoke of Spanish tyranny.
And then, sitting right across the mahogany table from him, you have the men actually writing the checks, who are meticulously planning to create a fortified American slave empire.
You really have to wonder how López navigated this.
Could he have possibly been ignorant that his grand liberation movement was just a Trojan horse for a pro-slavery land grab?
That is the million-dollar historical question. It's heavily debated. Some historians argue López was a sincere, if naive, liberator who was tragically captured by his backers.
The theory is that he needed the money so desperately to launch his invasion that he willfully blinded himself to their true intentions.
Exactly. He convinced himself he could use their money to win and then somehow outmaneuver them later.
And the other theory.
Others argue he was a cynical pragmatist who told his Southern backers exactly what they wanted to hear to get their gold, while telling his Cuban exiles something entirely different.
He's just playing both sides of the chessboard to get what he wants.
Yeah, pretty much. But regardless of his internal thoughts, the historical record shows just how deeply entangled he became with the Southern establishment.
Because to lead this private invasion force, López didn't just want random mercenaries. He actively sought out top-tier establishment American military talent.
He really did. With Governor Quitman's blessing and active encouragement, López formally approached two men to take field command of his army.
And this blew my mind. The first was Jefferson Davis. The second was Robert E. Lee.
The very same. Both men were prominent, highly respected military figures at the time.
Wait, the men who would literally lead the Confederacy a decade later?
Yes. Both of them ultimately declined the offer, mostly because they recognized the legal risks of violating the Neutrality Act. But the mere fact that López was sitting in a parlor with them,
formally offering them command of a rogue, illegal mercenary army, it shows you everything you need to know.
this wasn't some fringe, back-alley conspiracy hatched by a few crazy extremists. This plot was sitting right in the dead center of the mainstream Southern political elite.
Okay, so the venture capital is secured. The Southern political machine is quietly, if illegally, providing cover for him. Now López needs the actual men.
The boots on the ground who are going to march into gunfire.
Right. And this is where the story of the flag itself finally comes into physical reality, right? This is when they design the visual brand for the invasion.
Yes. In 1850, as López is utilizing his newly raised funds to prepare his forces, the flag is born.
The design is traditionally credited to López himself, collaborating with a prominent Cuban exile poet named Miguel Teurbe Tolón.
They finalized the design. The 3 blue stripes for the regions of Cuba, the 2 white stripes for the purity of the cause, the red triangle for the blood of the patriots, and the single white star.
And there is strong historical consensus that Tolón's wife, Amelia, was the one who physically procured the silk and sewed the very first prototype of the flag.
And the geography of where that sewing took place is just dripping with dark irony.
Where was it made?
It was sewn in a house in New Orleans.
Wow. The absolute capital, the commercial, financial, and ideological beating heart of the Southern slave empire dream. That is where the flag of Cuban independence was first stitched together.
Let's analyze the visual argument of that flag, specifically that single white star, because nothing in geopolitical branding is an accident.
That is not a generic star. That is a direct threat to the Spanish Empire, isn't it?
It is a direct, undeniable echo of the Republic of Texas. The Lone Star of Texas was universally famous at this time.
Because Texas had been a Mexican province, American settlers had rebelled. They fought for and won a brief period as an independent republic with a single star on their flag.
And then, exactly as planned, they were annexed into the United States as a massive slave state.
So by putting a single star on the Cuban flag, López and his designers were making a crystal clear visual statement to anyone who saw it. Cuba is the next Texas.
Cuba will follow the exact same mechanism: rebellion, brief independence, and then seamless annexation into the American system.
So every time a soldier looks up at that flag, they aren't seeing a symbol of perpetual Cuban sovereignty. They're seeing a billboard for American annexation.
Which brings us to the men who are actually standing shoulder to shoulder looking up at it.
Because the army López assembles to invade Cuba is one of the most bizarre, polyglot, contradictory groups of human beings you could possibly force onto one ship.
It truly defies logic when you break down the ranks. You have vastly different, highly conflicting motivations packed into the exact same small army.
At the top, obviously, you have the wealthy planters and southern elites. They aren't all marching in the mud, but their money, their ships, and their political influence are guiding the whole thing.
Their motivation is pure: the economic and political expansion of the American slave system.
Right. They are the board of directors. Then below them, you have the middle management and the rank and file, the common American filibusters. Who are these guys?
These are mostly young men, many of them hardened combat veterans of the Mexican-American War who had been demobilized and were restless.
Like the detachment led by Colonel William Crittenden, who we will delve into deeply in a moment.
Exactly. These young Americans aren't necessarily fighting out of deep ideological conviction for either slavery or Cuban liberty. They are adventurers.
They are products of manifest destiny who believe taking land is their birthright. They are looking for glory, they are looking for massive land grants in Cuba, and quite frankly, they are looking for plunder.
Okay, so you have the slave empire financiers pulling the strings, and you have the glory-seeking mercenaries holding the rifles. That makes a cynical sort of sense.
But then you have this third group, and this is the one that completely breaks my brain. You have European revolutionaries.
What is genuinely fascinating here is the massive influx of European veterans into this American expansionist scheme. We have to zoom out and look at the global context to understand the mechanism here.
We have to remember what was happening in Europe just prior to this, in 1848. It's historically known as the Spring of Nations, or the Year of Revolution.
Exactly. There were massive democratic anti-monarchy uprisings across the entire European continent. The citizens of France, the German states, the Italian states, and Hungary all rose up against their kings and emperors.
They were demanding constitutional republics and basic human rights. It was a massive wave of idealism.
But ultimately, by 1849, the combined military might of the old European empires, particularly the Austrian and Russian empires, violently crushed almost all of these democratic uprisings.
And so the consequence is that you have thousands of these hardcore, idealistic freedom fighters who have just lost their bloody wars for democracy, fleeing across the ocean to the United States as political refugees.
Precisely. They arrive in American ports, particularly New Orleans and New York, destitute but completely ideologically committed to the concept of universal liberty.
And López recruits them. He actively seeks out and recruits Hungarian and German combat veterans of the 1848 revolutions.
He does. And this is where the historical logic just gets so tangled.
Yeah, how does that possibly work? How do you get hardcore anti-imperialist European freedom fighters to march in the exact same army as Mississippi slaveholders whose stated goal is to expand human bondage?
The cognitive dissonance is astronomical. The only way it functions mechanically is through a profound mutual delusion.
You have to understand how the European veterans mapped their own recent trauma onto the Cuban situation.
Exactly. When a Hungarian revolutionary looked at Cuba, they didn't see the complex dynamics of American slavery versus abolition. They saw a classic, simple European struggle.
They saw an oppressed local population being ruled by a tyrannical, old-world European empire, in this case, Spain.
To a Hungarian who had just fought and bled, fighting the Austrian Empire, fighting the Spanish Empire in Cuba made perfect moral sense. It was the exact same fight, just on a tropical island. They genuinely believed they were fighting to liberate an oppressed people.
So they are just completely missing or willfully ignoring the fact that the man paying for their rifles, their uniforms, and their ship tickets wants to turn the island into a giant, horrific plantation annexed to the United States.
They just screen out the American context entirely. Or perhaps they eagerly consumed the romantic rhetoric of López, the beautiful poetry of Cuban liberty, and actively ignored the dark reality of where the money was coming from.
You end up with a single military force where the left hand genuinely believes is fighting a holy war for universal liberty, and the right hand is meticulously fighting for the expansion of chattel slavery.
And they're all marching shoulder to shoulder, looking up at the exact same Lone Star flag.
It is a powder keg of conflicting ideals. So the flag is sewn, the venture capital is raised, this strange, conflicted, polyglot army is armed and ready.
It is time to actually put this plan into action and plant that flag in Cuban soil. Let's trace the mechanics of the actual invasions, plural. Because he didn't just try this once and give up.
No. López made 3 separate, highly orchestrated attempts to invade Cuba between 1849 and 1851, and the first attempt, known as the Round Island Expedition of 1849, never even makes it to open water.
It is crushed before it begins.
Why? What is the mechanism that stops a privately funded army before it can even set sail?
The federal roadblock happened. As we discussed, this expedition was highly illegal under the Neutrality Act. And in 1849, the President of the United States is Zachary Taylor.
Now, Zachary Taylor is a fascinating figure in this context. He's a Southerner, he is a military man, and he actually owns enslaved people himself.
But politically, he is a Whig, and he is a staunch Unionist. Critically, he has absolutely no interest in allowing rogue private armies to launch schemes that are going to immediately reopen the explosive Union-destroying debate over slavery.
Right. They just barely survived the crisis of the Mexican Cession. He is trying to keep the fragile country from tearing itself apart in the Civil War, and the absolute last thing he needs is a rogue army conquering a massive new slave island.
Exactly. The political math for Taylor is simple. This expedition threatens the stability of the entire United States. So when López gathers roughly 600 men and charters transport ships near Round Island off the coast of Mississippi, President Taylor does not hesitate.
He doesn't issue a polite warning. He uses the hard power of the state. He sends the United States Navy.
He orders a naval blockade of the anchorage and orders federal marshals to seize the ships. The filibusters are essentially blockaded on their own island, starved of supplies, and stripped of their transport before they can even set sail.
By September of 1849, the force completely disperses. Okay, so round 1 goes to the federal government enforcing the law.
But as we know from history, when there is this much private venture capital involved and the potential ROI is an entire country, they don't just give up because they got a cease and desist letter.
No, they just find a better place to launch from, and they get stealthier. Which brings us to the second attempt, May of 1850, the Cárdenas expedition.
This is the moment the flag finally sees the light of day on Cuban soil. López manages to evade federal authorities by launching from multiple ports and rendezvousing at sea.
He successfully lands a force of about 500 to 600 men at the port city of Cárdenas, which is located on the northern coast of Cuba, east of Havana.
Let's describe the tactical reality of this landing. What happens when 600 heavily armed mercenaries step off the boats into a Spanish colony?
It is a violent, chaotic, deeply confusing landing. The Spanish military is caught slightly off guard, but the local garrison quickly rallies.
A sharp, brutal firefight erupts in the streets of the city. The filibusters, who possess a high number of Mexican-American war combat veterans, manage to push the Spanish troops back.
They actually managed to seize the center of the town. During the fighting, they set fire to the Spanish governor's house, burning it to the ground.
And in the midst of this smoking chaos, Narciso López raises the Lone Star flag. It is the very first time the flag we know today flies in Cuba.
I'm trying to picture this scene. The town is burning. The Spanish troops have temporarily retreated but are regrouping. López is standing in the plaza with this flag that was sewn in a parlor in New Orleans.
And now they wait, because when you look at the military mechanics of this invasion, the entire strategic premise, the whole reason they thought they could conquer an island defended by tens of thousands of Spanish regulars with only 600 guys, is that they wouldn't have to fight alone.
That is the absolute core premise of the entire filibuster movement. The grand, unifying theory that López forcefully sold to his Southern financiers to get their money and sold to his European idealists to get their blood was that the Cuban people were desperately yearning for freedom.
The theory was that the local population was a tinderbox. And the moment López landed and raised the flag of liberation, the Cuban people would instantly rise up in a massive, spontaneous, popular rebellion against the Spanish.
The filibusters weren't supposed to be an occupying army. They were supposed to be the glorious spark that lit the revolutionary powder keg.
So they raise the flag, they clear the plaza, they wait for the masses to pour into the streets, grab whatever weapons they can find, and join the glorious revolution.
What actually happens?
Nothing. Absolute crushing silence, nobody comes. The massive popular uprising completely and utterly fails to materialize.
The streets remain empty of local supporters. The silence from the Cuban population is deafening, and it seals the doom of the expedition.
Look, if I can offer an analogy here, it's like breaking into a heavily guarded corporate headquarters to throw a surprise liberation party for the employees. And the supposed guests of honor lock their office doors, pull the shades down, and call corporate security on you.
It is a total strategic collapse. Why? Why didn't a single local civilian join them?
We need to spend significant time dissecting the mechanics of this failure, because the missing Cuban support is the empirical heart of this whole story. It exposes the massive flaw in the filibusters' worldview.
When historians analyze the archives and the primary accounts of the Cárdenas landing, they debate several competing theories for why the locals stayed home. We have to look at all of them to understand the reality on the ground.
The first theory is the most pragmatic: sheer terror. The Spanish military presence in Cuba was massive, well-trained, heavily armed, and utterly ruthless in putting down colonial dissent.
Right. I think if I put myself in the shoes of a local Cuban civilian, a shopkeeper, or a farmer in Cárdenas, I'm doing the brutal math of survival.
I look out my window and see 500 random guys with a weird flag. I know there are 30,000 professional Spanish troops on the island. I know this is a suicide mission.
My first instinct isn't ideology, it's self-preservation. I think you guys are all going to be dead by Tuesday, and if I walk out there and hand you a cup of water, the Spanish are going to hang me and my family in the town square on Wednesday.
Pure fear of Spanish retaliation is a powerful mechanism. It is entirely logical, and survival instinct undoubtedly played a massive role.
The second theory revolves around indifference and a lack of legitimacy.
There is a strong possibility that a significant portion of the Cuban population simply didn't view López as their legitimate liberator. Remember his history. He was a Venezuelan-born former Spanish enforcer who spent 2 decades oppressing the locals.
Now he shows up with a bunch of English-speaking Americans and German refugees. The locals may have viewed them not as saviors, but simply as foreign interlopers, completely disconnected from the daily reality and culture of Cuban life.
Why risk your life for an opportunistic foreigner?
And what is the third theory? Because this one seems to strike at the dark heart of the Southern financiers' plans.
The third theory is perhaps the most damning for López's American backers. Did the Cuban population actively distrust an independence movement that was clearly and visibly fronted by American slaveholders?
Cuba had a massive enslaved population, but it also had a complex, multi-layered social strata that included a large number of free people of color,
as well as a developing, distinct Cuban national identity among the intellectuals and professionals.
Right, so they look at the Lone Star flag being raised in their plaza, and they don't see universal freedom. They see the history of Texas. They see a mechanism for annexation.
Exactly. The idea of trading Spanish colonial rule, which was terrible for American plantation-style slavery and English-speaking masters, wasn't exactly an appealing upgrade for the majority of the population.
The historical record leaves the exact combination of these reasons open to interpretation. But the physical outcome is indisputable.
The silence of the Cuban people speaks volumes against the arrogant Southern assumption that Cuba just inherently yearned for American-led domination.
Whatever the internal reasoning of the locals, the reality on the ground in Cárdenas quickly becomes a nightmare for López.
It is a disaster, with zero local support mobilizing, and reports that massive columns of elite Spanish reinforcements are quickly marching toward the town. López realizes the math.
He is trapped. He orders his men to retreat back onto their ship, the Creole. They flee the harbor and make a desperate run for Key West, Florida, quite literally with a heavily armed Spanish warship chasing them across the water.
They barely make it into American waters before being blown out of the water.
A total, humiliating military and political failure. But here is the crazy part of the history. Despite the federal blockades under Taylor, despite the total lack of local Cuban-supported Cárdenas, despite literally fleeing for his life, the momentum of the American financiers pushes López to try again.
The venture capital is still sitting there, the intense political desire to expand slavery is still burning, and they push him to make one last, fatal attempt.
Which brings us to the final, bloody chapter of the filibuster expeditions. August of 1851, the Bahía Honda expedition.
This is where the story shifts from a kind of chaotic, misguided adventure into a genuine, grim tragedy. The historical reality of what happens next is incredibly dark.
And we want to maintain a measured, exact tone as we report the mechanics of how this ends.
Yes, there is absolutely no need to sensationalize this. The historical facts are grim enough on their own. The final expedition manages to slip out of New Orleans.
López has once again gathered several hundred men, that same polyglot mix of young American adventurers, Cuban exiles, and European veterans.
But from the very moment they land at Bahía Honda, a coastal area west of Havana, the operational mechanics completely break down. It is a military catastrophe.
Well, what goes wrong this time?
Almost everything. The landing is botched, and the force is immediately divided into smaller, isolated groups. The communication and coordination are terrible.
They are marching through dense, unfamiliar tropical terrain. And once again, they wait for the grand Cuban uprising to save them.
And once again, there is absolute silence from the locals. No one joins them. But this time, the Spanish military does not let them retreat to their ships.
The Spanish forces encircle the area and methodically hunt down the scattered, disorganized columns of filibusters in the wilderness.
And this leads to the capture of a specific detachment that fundamentally changes the nature of this event. It turns this from a failed colonial skirmish in the jungle into a massive, explosive international diplomatic scandal.
Let's look at the mechanics of what happens to Colonel William Crittenden.
Colonel William Logan Crittenden was an American commanding a detachment of roughly 50 men. During the chaotic retreat, his group gets entirely cut off from López's main force.
They try to escape on small boats, but they are intercepted at sea, surrounded by the Spanish Navy, and captured.
Now, we have to look at who Crittenden was to understand the diplomatic fallout. Crittenden is not just a random, anonymous adventurer. He is a West Point graduate.
He is a decorated veteran of the Mexican-American War. And crucially, he is a member of one of the most powerful political families in the United States. He is the nephew of John J. Crittenden.
Let's contextualize that for the listener. Who is John J. Crittenden in 1851?
John J. Crittenden is the sitting Attorney General of the United States. He is the chief law enforcement officer of the federal government.
Oh, wow. So if we map that onto modern times to understand the sheer shock of this, the Spanish Empire hasn't just captured a rogue mercenary. They have captured the nephew of the Attorney General.
The optics of that are insane.
Exactly. And the Spanish authorities in Havana, led by the Captain General of Cuba, understand exactly what they have. They decide they're going to use Crittenden to send an unequivocal, brutal message to the United States government.
And to any Southern financier thinking of funding these private wars, the Spanish legal mechanism kicks in. They refuse to treat Crittenden and his 50 men as prisoners of war.
Because no formal war was ever declared by the U.S. government.
Precisely. Under Spanish, and indeed international law at the time, an armed force invading a sovereign country without the backing of a recognized state are legally classified as pirates and freebooters.
They are criminals, not soldiers. The Spanish authorities afford them no diplomatic protections.
On August 16, 1851, Colonel Crittenden and his 50 American men are lined up and executed by firing squad at the Castle of Ataris near Havana.
50 Americans, many from prominent, well-connected Southern families, executed against a wall.
And the mechanism of destruction doesn't stop there. 2 weeks later, the Spanish military finally tracks down and captures Narciso López himself.
His mercenary army is completely destroyed, his grand local uprising never materialized, and he is captured wandering in the interior. The Spanish want to make an ultimate example of the man who led this.
On September 1, 1851, Narciso López is executed in a public plaza in Havana. But he is not given a military firing squad like the Americans. He is executed by the garrote.
What is the specific mechanism of that?
The garrote is a method of execution involving a brass or iron collar that is tightened around the condemned person's neck by a screw mechanism, resulting in strangulation.
Crucially, in the Spanish colonial system, the firing squad was considered an honorable death for a soldier. The garrote was a brutal, physically degrading public execution designed specifically for common criminals and traitors.
They wanted to strip López of any romantic, revolutionary aura. With his death, the clandestine war he led dies with him.
The flag has fallen. The men who designed it and marched under it are dead. But the shockwaves of those executions do not stay contained on the island of Cuba.
They hit the American South with massive force, and the reaction reveals so much about the true underlying nature of this whole venture. Let's look at the mechanics of the fallout, specifically what happens in New Orleans when the news arrives.
When the news of the executions, specifically the death of Crittenden and the 50 Americans, reaches New Orleans in early September of 1851, the city absolutely explodes in violence.
It becomes one of the most intense, destructive urban riots of the period. Mobs take to the streets, but it isn't random violence. They specifically target Spanish interests.
They storm and sack the Spanish consulate, destroying official records and defacing portraits of the Spanish queen. They attack the offices of the city's Spanish-language newspaper, smashing the printing presses.
They ransack Spanish-owned businesses and coffee houses throughout the city. Now, if a casual observer read a headline about a massive mob attacking a Spanish consulate immediately after a failed Cuban revolution, they might make a logical assumption.
They might think, oh, the people of New Orleans are furious that the democratic ideal of Cuban liberty has been crushed. They are mourning the death of freedom.
You'd think they were rioting out of idealistic grief, right?
But when you look at the historical analysis, it points to a much darker reality. The consensus is that this was not idealistic grief over the abstract concept of Cuban liberty.
The rage tearing through the streets of New Orleans was a deeply proprietary rage.
Proprietary, meaning they were furiously angry because they owned it.
Exactly. They were the shareholders. New Orleans was the primary financial engine of the entire expedition. The merchants, the wealthy planters, and the leading citizens of that city had bankrolled the invasion.
The guns that were captured were bought with their money. Furthermore, the men who died against that wall in Havana weren't abstract foreign freedom fighters. They were the local sons of New Orleans and Southern society.
The city was furious about a massive, completely lost financial investment and the deaths of their own people.
The violence perfectly proves the central thesis of our discussion. The true emotional, financial, and political investment in this clandestine war ran strictly through the slaveholding South.
It was about American economic expansion and American losses.
Yeah.
It was never truly about genuine Cuban independence.
It is the raw, violent anger of a massive venture capital investment going up in smoke. It's a remarkably dark chapter.
The mechanics of the aftermath are swift. The American federal government has to scramble to officially apologize to Spain for the consulate being burned down, paying reparations to prevent an actual war.
The filibuster movement suffers a massive, crippling blow to its prestige. And the Southern dream of annexing Cuba as a slave state, while they try political means for another decade, eventually dies completely when the American Civil War breaks out.
The financiers of this expedition, the men who tried to export slavery to Cuba, end up fighting and losing a massive war to preserve slavery on their own soil.
The men are dead, the movement is dead, and the political ideology that funded it is eventually destroyed in the fires of the Civil War. It seems like the absolute end of the story.
But it's not. Because we have to bring this full circle. We have to finish the biography of the flag itself, because the physical design did not die with López.
Decades pass. Half a century goes by. The world changes completely. It is now 1902.
Through years of their own grueling, legitimate, bloody wars of independence fought by actual Cubans, and eventually with the complex intervention of the United States in the Spanish-American War, Cuba finally achieves its goal.
The Spanish Empire is gone forever. The Republic of Cuba is born.
And when a new republic is born, it needs a symbol. It needs a national flag.
Right. And of all the designs they could have chosen, of all the symbols they could have created from scratch to represent this new, sovereign, independent nation, what flag do they choose to fly over the capital in Havana?
They choose the exact same Lone Star banner. The one originally designed by an exiled poet and a contradictory Venezuelan general.
The one physically sewn in a parlor in New Orleans by the architects of an American slave empire.
The one first raised at Cárdenas by a bizarre mercenary army of Southern slaveholders, American adventurers, and confused European revolutionaries. That specific, precise design is officially adopted in 1902 as the national flag of Cuba.
It is the ultimate historical plot twist. It is a massive, almost unbelievable irony.
If we synthesize everything we've unpacked today, a flag designed with the explicit, heavily documented intention of making Cuba an American slave state was completely repurposed by history.
Through decades of subsequent genuine Cuban struggle, it was washed clean of its annexationist pro-slavery origins. It became the ultimate, unassailable emblem of a sovereign, independent Cuban nation.
The symbol completely outran the intentions of the men who first raised it. It really makes you pause and think about the physical world around us.
We see flags, corporate logos, statues, and political slogans every single day, and we naturally assume their meaning is fixed. We assume they mean exactly what they've always meant and what their creators intended them to mean.
But history is so much messier and so much more fluid than that.
It is entirely fluid. The wealthy Southern planters who paid for the silk of that flag would be utterly horrified to see it flying today over an independent Cuba that isn't tethered to the United States.
And the Hungarian idealists who died marching under it would be thrilled. I want to leave you with this thought to mull over as you go about your day.
Once a symbol is released into the world, once the fabric is sewn and it is raised up on a pole for people to see, it no longer belongs to its creator.
It belongs to whatever history decides to do with it. Think about the symbols you interact with today, the ones you might even wear or display. How many of them, if you trace the mechanics of their creation all the way back to their roots, might mean the exact literal opposite of what the person who designed them intended?
History doesn't just record our intentions.
It has a habit of completely hijacking them.